Brilliant. So, virtue ethics is our ethical theory that we need to know in year 13. Okay, this ethical theory is quite nice because it builds a lot of the stuff that you did in year 12 when you looked at natural law. The reason is that this is Aristotle's ethical theory, and although we mainly looked at Aquinas for natural law, the ideas are still the same. This is still the idea that it's all about achieving your purpose. It's all about achieving what you want to flourish, to be a good person. So when we looked at this in year 12, we looked at Aristotle, we looked at it quite briefly, but we've introduced this idea of eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is the goal of virtue ethics. It's this idea that we are good if we are flourishing, if we are achieving our purpose. So for that reason, virtue ethics is a teleological ethical theory because it's about the outcomes of achieving your purpose. Okay? That's virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is different from the ethical theories we looked at in year 12, particularly utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, because instead of asking what you should do in terms of your actions, it asks who you should be in terms of your character. It's about looking inward at your heart and your character as a person, rather than you must do this, you must do that, you must do this. So utilitarianism says do the greatest good for the greatest number. Kantian ethics says achieve the categorical imperative. Focus, don't you focus. Okay, focus. Whereas virtue ethics says be a good person and have a good character, have a virtuous character. So we call this agent-centred. It looks at you as an agent and how you can be a good person. And the idea being, of course, that if you are a good person, you will naturally do good things. That's the idea. So you don't have to worry too much about laws and rules in the way that, say, Kantian ethics might do, or natural law might do to some extent. Instead, you just have to think, what would a good person do? What would a virtuous person do? And become that kind of person. Okay? So agent-centred. Now, this idea is mainly Aristotle, but it was developed from Plato. And Plato historically had these 4 cardinal virtues. And this isn't as important as the stuff from Aristotle, but it's one of those nice things you might chuck in an introduction to an essay. Starts with Plato. Plato believed there were 4 cardinal virtues, and you could definitely criticise these. They can be critiqued. And they were temperance, courage, prudence, and justice. You may not know all of those words. Temperance is moderation. So it's the idea that you do things in moderation, not to an excess. So that does fit on with this idea of the golden mean that we'll come to in a bit. But temperance means not to do stuff in excess. Often nowadays, when people talk about temperance, they mean not drinking too much alcohol. That's often how that word's used nowadays. But it just means, in general, someone who's temperate doesn't take things to excess. Okay? Courage, pretty obvious, you know what courage is, being brave and so on. Prudence, that's practical wisdom. If you're prudent, you employ your common sense in a good way. Okay, so being prudent is common sense. There's a bank called the Prudential. It's the idea that this is the common sense bank. Okay, that's what prudence means. And justice obviously means something that's fair and equal. Okay, so there were the 4 cardinal virtues according to Plato. Aristotle would have also been familiar with those ideas, and he developed them into his virtue ethics. He defined the virtues into 2 categories: the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. Okay, the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. The intellectual virtues, not everyone can achieve. We might today say that not everyone can be really good at maths. Not everyone can be really good at science or literature or reading or writing or something like that. But Aristotle believed that we could all develop the moral virtues. And the moral virtues are the virtues of our character, and that's the agent-centred bit. So intellectual virtues are things like being good at mathematics. Moral virtues are things like being kind or generous or just or honest. They are the moral virtues. How do you develop those moral virtues? You develop them by practice. So if you want to be kind, if you want to develop the character of being kind, so that you want that to make part of yourself, practice by being kind to people. And the idea is that practice makes perfect. So Aristotle was seeing moral virtues as not dissimilar to learning to play an instrument. If you wanted to learn to play the guitar well, you'd have to practice by playing the guitar. Likewise, if you want to be kind, practice by being kind. If you want to be honest, practice by being honest. And you might think, well, that doesn't happen, but actually it does. You walk down a corridor in a school and you will walk through a door and you'll hold it open for the person coming behind you. You don't even think about it, you just do it. Why? Well, because you practiced, you've ingrained that idea of kindness into your lives. And I promise you, you could try it. If you decided from now on that you were going to, every time you saw someone who was homeless on the street, you were going to give them a couple of quid. To start off with, you'd be doing it in a very artificial way. You'd have to think about it, it'd be very artificial, and you'd be giving them a couple of quid. You know, really sort of deliberately making a point of doing it. But after a while, you wouldn't even think about it. You'd see someone's homeless and you just reach into your pocket without even having to think. It would become part of your character. It would become a habit. Being kind can be a habit. Being patient can be a habit. You can learn to be patient, believe it or not. And that's what Aristotle believed, definitely. He believed that these moral virtues, you develop them through habit and practice. Okay? So you had to use your reason, your common sense, your ability to understand the world, your intellect, and practice to achieve the outcome of eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is flourishing. Okay? This is this idea here. And eudaimonia is this idea that you are a good person if you flourish. Now I've drawn a cheesy little drawing here trying to explain what I mean by eudaimonia, but I've drawn it as a mountain. And the idea might be for Aristotle that you are trying to climb to the top of this sort of almost impossibly good thing, this mountain, and you have to be kind of orientated in the right direction, as in you have to be trying to climb the mountain, you have to be trying to flourish, you have to be trying to achieve your purpose. So I think of it as like, you know, like a rock climber climbing up the top of a mountain. They're never going to get to the top, probably, but if they're orientated in the right direction, if they're facing in the right direction, they're aiming towards their goal, that's a good person. Okay, so you're never going to be perfectly courageous or perfectly honest or perfectly kind or perfectly just or anything like that. But if you are improving your character and developing your character, you are flourishing, you are a good person. Okay? So to use the more formal language, you are going from your potential, what you could be, to your telos, your purpose. And that change, that actuality, is you becoming leading a virtuous life and learning these moral virtues. Okay? That's the main idea. Now, how does that look like sort of in practice? Well, for Aristotle, he felt it could be explained using the idea of the golden mean. He said that all virtuous character traits exist on a sort of spectrum of a golden mean, where the virtuous character trait is in the middle, and then you have, or is some sort of balancing point between two vices, two bad things, a vice of deficiency, which is too little, and a vice of excess, which is too much. So you've got a vice of deficiency, for example, in the case of courage, which is your golden mean, a vice of deficiency would be a coward, someone who has too little courage. Whereas a vice of excess would be someone who was foolhardy, had too much courage, someone who ran into a situation and got themselves into trouble without thinking about the consequences. So you've got golden mean, this is the virtuous character. And then you've got a vice on either end. A common mistake that people make with this is they think of it as being virtue on one end of the spectrum, vice on the other. It isn't that. The virtue is in the middle, the midpoint, between the balancing point between the two vices, one of deficiency, too little, one of excess. Okay? That idea is really important. So if you were trying to apply this ethical theory to an ethical topic, you could use the golden mean to do it. Let's imagine we were looking at the issues surrounding sexual ethics, because that's one of our A2 topics. And let's imagine we were looking at something like homosexual relationships, and you were trying to decide if they were virtuous or not. You might say, well, what is the golden mean that we're looking at here? Surely the golden mean would be some kind of love, would be a golden mean. And not having enough love and perhaps being kind of a pushover on the other end or something like that. Would a homosexual relationship lead to that golden mean? Could it develop a good character? Could it make you a better person if you were in that kind of relationship? Well, you're likely to say yes, of course it could. So that might be a good thing. Whereas someone else might say, oh no, I don't think that could. They would say, well, it's a bad thing. But it'd be about what kind of character you develop, because it's agent-centred. When we look at the environment, and we look at how people might react to the environment, Aristotle would say, well, what would a good person do? What would a virtuous person say about the environment? How would they feel about it? What character traits are you developing that look after the environment? And where are they on this golden mean? So you might say, let's imagine you're thinking of polluting a river. You might think of there being too little pollution because there's no economic development at all. You know, we don't burn any fossil fuels at all, and we don't have any electricity or any power because we're so worried about pollution. That might be deficiency. You might say there's an excess on the other end, which is way too much, which is probably where we're at right now, and then there'd be a golden mean. Enough pollution that we can actually survive in our, or flourish in our environment and achieve eudaimonia, you know, for example, have electricity and so on, but not enough that we are just wantonly, deliberately destroying the Earth's environment like we perhaps do at the moment. So when we look at environmental ethics, the golden mean can very nicely be applied. Okay, but we come back to that. So that's basically it for virtue ethics. It is Aristotle's idea that ethics can be done based on your character, what kind of person you are. And developing who you are as a person, that's called agent-centred. So it's about the character traits that you develop. You develop them by practice. Okay? You develop them by practice, like you might learn how to learn to play an instrument. And one other way that you can learn, this last little point here, is that you can look at the example of virtuous people and follow them. So let's say you see someone very virtuous, someone who's a very, very good person, let's say Jesus. You might then decide to think, oh, that's a good example, I'll follow that example, and that will make me a more virtuous person. Or you might say, I'm going to follow someone else who I think is an example of a virtuous person, Martin Luther King, or someone like that. You look at their example and you copy it. And this idea of habit and copying virtuous people, if you do psychology or sociology, you might say that's exactly what happens. If your parents are virtuous people, or the people who raised you, brought you up are virtuous people, you have probably learned character traits from them that are virtuous. You know, you may have learned, for example, to be kind, or to be patient, or to be generous, or to be forgiving from your parents, from the people around you. You learn from examples around you in the world, especially when you're a child, but also when you're an adult. If you go and get a job, and your first boss is an absolute git who treats everyone really meanly and doesn't respect anybody and doesn't treat anyone very well, then you might, when you become a boss or you run a business or something, treat people in the same way. You might learn that negative character trait. Likewise, you might learn the positive. So, you know, talk to teachers, and teachers will say that they have a big impact, because if teachers aren't virtuous, how could they expect their students to be? The idea being that students, particularly young students, learn from the people around them. Okay, so the idea is you can learn from the example of virtuous people. That's pretty much it. We're done, Toby.
Smile.
Anything you like, you can pause it. Yeah, I shouldn't have given you the thing. You know, I'm just going to cut this off, right? This is not going to be on the video.